The corn was 2 weeks old. Clara Bowen knew that the way she knew the ache in her back every morning, a deep, settled thing that had made a home in her bones since the spring planting. She had counted every day since she pressed those seeds into the dark soil along the Republican River, had watched each pale shoot push through the crust, had stood at the north end of the field in the early quiet and counted the rows like a woman counting coins she could not afford to lose. Mid-May 1883, the valley smelled of creek mud and new grass. The sky above southern Nebraska ran wide and blue and indifferent, as though it had no opinion about whether a 26-year-old woman kept her land or lost it. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here, we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, stories of resilience, of quiet determination, of women who refused to surrender to the land or to the laughter of those who doubted them. Picture Clara Bowen there, in that field, as the sun rose over the far ridge. She was not yet a woman anyone would remember. She was simply a homesteader, alone on 160 acres, with a sod house that leaked when the rain came from the north and a hand-dug well that had gone stubborn in the dry spells. But she had something the land had not yet managed to break, a kind of patient stubbornness that looked a lot like hope, even when hope had no good reason to stay. She found the first cutworm on a Tuesday morning. She had gone out before full light, the way she always did, walking the rows while the dew was still heavy enough to darken the hem of her dress. The young stalks stood shin-high, most of them, green and straight and full of promise. Except they were not all standing. She stopped at the third row from the east fence, crouched down, pressed 2 fingers into the soil beside a stalk that had listed sideways overnight, its stem gone soft and wrong just below the surface. She dug carefully, 1 inch, 2 inches, and there it was, pale, fat, curled tight as a question mark, a cutworm. She sat back on her heels and did not speak. There was no one to speak to. She moved to the next stalk, down, another one, the next. She walked the full length of that row, counting severed plants, then crossed to the next row and the next, moving faster now, her stomach pulling tight with each small ruined shoot she found tipped against the ground like something tired of trying. By the time the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, she had walked every row. She stood at the field's edge and did the arithmetic the way a woman does when she has no room to be wrong. Roughly 24 plants already gone, the infestation clearly spreading south from the creek bend. Cutworms worked underground, worked at night, worked quietly and without mercy. At this rate, this exact rate, she had 3 weeks before the field was finished. 3 weeks. She turned the number over in her mind and looked at it from every angle, the way you look at a crack in a water barrel to see if it can be patched or if you are simply done. 3 weeks until the field was gone. And without a field, without proof of productive use come September, Mr. Whitcomb at the county land office would open his ledger and write 2 words she had spent a year of her life trying to prevent. Claim forfeit. 160 acres. 1 sod house. 1 hand-dug well. 1 root cellar packed with last autumn's preserves. 1 year of her life pressed into this ground like those seeds. She stood very still in the morning light and breathed. Then she went to get her chickens. She rode to Hastings Supply the same morning, still wearing dirt on her knees from the field. The horse knew the road well enough that she could let her hands rest loose on the reins and think. And she thought hard all 7 miles, turning over every remedy she had ever heard a neighbor mention, every scrap of advice passed at a church social or murmured across a fence line. By the time she tied up at the post's hitching rail, she had already dismissed most of them. She did not have enough wood ash. She did not have enough time to flood and drain the rows. She needed something that worked fast and worked deep and worked now. Hastings himself was behind the counter, a heavy-set man who kept his store organized with a precision that suggested he had strong opinions about the right place for everything. She asked her question plainly, the way she always asked things. No softening, no performance. Cutworms, she said. Bad. What have you got? He had imported lime powder. Effective, he said. Used back east by operations that had the means for it. She asked the price. He told her. She stood very still for a moment. the way you stand when a number hits you like cold water. It was more than she would see from egg sales all summer, more than she would clear from the garden, more than she had in the tin box under her floorboard, by a margin that felt almost deliberate, as though the situation had been designed specifically to be just out of reach. She thanked him. She did not buy anything. She untied the horse and rode back the way she had come. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. For Clara Bowen, the ride home was a crucible. The anger was there. She was honest enough not to pretend it wasn't. But it burned low and even, the way a cook fire burns when you have learned to manage it. And she used it to keep herself thinking, rather than feeling. There had to be another way. There was always another way. You simply had to be willing to look foolish finding it. She was 3 miles from home when she slowed the horse without meaning to. Below the road, where her fence line bent south toward the cabin, her hens were working the garden. She had let them in that morning before she rode out. They cleared pests from the squash beds, a practice she had started the previous summer out of pure laziness and kept because it worked. She watched them from the saddle. They moved in that particular way chickens move when they are being entirely themselves, heads tilted, feet raking, utterly committed to the work of finding what was hidden just beneath the surface. She watched one hen stop, scratch twice with deliberate precision, and pull something pale and curved from the dirt. A grub. Gone before she could blink. The hen moved on without ceremony, already looking for the next one. Clara sat on the horse and did not move for a long moment. The idea came the way good ideas come, not as a flash, but as a slow recognition, like something that had been true all along and had only now decided to make itself known. She did not sleep that night. She did not try to. By the time she unsaddled the horse and put him up, her mind was already running ahead of her hands, sketching the thing in the air, the shape of it, the bones of it, what it would need to be. Open at the bottom, low to the ground, long enough to sit over a single row without crushing the stalks. Something the hens could not escape and the worms could not hide from. Something she could push. The collapsed barn was 1.5 miles north, and she hitched the wagon by lantern light. The old frame had come down 2 winters prior. Nobody's fault, just age and a bad February. The lumber had been sitting in a tilted heap ever since, half sunk in the grass. She worked by feel as much as by light, pulling boards free, testing each one for rot with her thumbnail, stacking what held and leaving what did not. 4 wagon wheel rims she found buried under a collapsed lean-to wall, rusted but solid. She rolled them to the wagon one at a time. Then the baling wire, a whole coil of it, stiff and unforgiving, looped over a fence post like someone had left it meaning to come back. She did not stop moving until she had what she needed. Back at the cabin, she worked through the dark. The lantern hung from a nail on the outside wall, throwing a low yellow light across the yard. The frame went up slow. She was not a carpenter's daughter. She had no practiced hand for joinery, no proper tools. But she had patience, and she had wire, and she had a picture in her head that she was determined to match. The wheel rims she spaced along the bottom edge for weight. The board she nailed and wired into a long, low cage, open at the base, with a plank door at one end she could lift from outside. The whole thing sat roughly knee-high, long enough to straddle a row, narrow enough to steer between them. She hammered the last nail in the gray hour before dawn, when the sky is not yet light, but the darkness has thinned enough to see your own hands. She was shaking, but not from cold. She caught 10 hens before the roosters had fully woken, tucking each one under her arm and settling them inside the pen through the lift door. They fussed and shifted, and then went quiet the way chickens do when they decide a situation is simply what it is. She gripped the frame at the push end. It was heavier than she'd hoped. The wheel rims scraped across the yard dirt. She pointed it at the cornfield, pointed it at the row where she had first found the cuts. That particular row, third from the east fence, where the stalks had gone soft at the base and fallen over in the night, like something had taken them quietly in the dark. She pushed. The pen moved. The hens lowered their heads. The hens found the first worm before she had pushed the pen 10 feet. She heard it, that quick, decisive scratch and peck that chickens make when they mean business, and she stopped the frame and leaned over to look. One of the red hens had her beak in the soil at the stalk base, and she pulled out something pale and curled, the size of a man's thumbnail, and swallowed it whole before the others could argue. Then they all understood what they were doing there. She did not have to push hard after that. She only had to steer. The hens put their heads down and went to work with a focus that shamed her a little, honestly, because they did not second-guess themselves. They scratched. They probed. They turned the loose soil with short, efficient kicks and found the worms where they hid an inch down, 2 inches down, curled against the base of every fourth or fifth stalk like small gray fists. The pen moved in short advances. Push, stop, let them work, push again. The row unspooled behind her, each stalk base opened and examined and left standing. By mid-morning she had finished the third row and started the fourth. Her arms burned from the weight of the frame. Her boots were dark with dew to the ankle. But when she looked back at the rows she had already run the pen through, she felt something she had not felt since May. The field looked survivable. She was on the 6th row when she heard the hoofbeats. He came from the west, a big man on a bay horse, riding the fence line the way a man does when he is not in a hurry, but is paying attention to something that bothers him. He pulled up at the corner post and looked. He looked for a long time without saying anything. She kept pushing. Then he started to laugh. It was not a small laugh. It was the kind that bends a man at the waist and makes him grab the nearest solid object to keep from going over. He held the fence post with both hands and laughed until his horse shifted sideways in confusion. And when he finally straightened up, there were tears at the corners of his eyes, which she could see even at that distance because the morning sun was behind her and it caught his face square. He managed 2 words before the laughing took him again. "Chicken wagon." She did not look up from the push hand. He rode off, still chuckling, and she heard him laughing again when he was far enough away that he thought she could not. Within 2 days, she knew the name had spread to every farm in the valley. She knew because of the way Mrs. Aldrin's boy stared when he rode past delivering flour. She knew because of the silence that replaced conversation when she stopped at Hastings to pick up a bolt of mending thread. The chicken wagon, the fool woman with her rolling hens. She filed it away and kept pushing. The last week of June came in dry and white bright, the kind of heat that sits on the land like a hand pressed flat. She was midway down the eastern rows when she heard hoofbeats on the road. Not the loose, easy pace of a neighbor, but the deliberate rhythm of a man with a scheduled destination. She straightened. A buggy, dark wool coat despite the heat, a leather case wedged beside him on the seat. She knew who it was before he pulled the reins. She had 4 rows left to push. She pushed them anyway, let him wait 1 minute and understand what she was doing before he said a word to her about what she was not doing. By the time she folded the pen against the fence post and walked to meet him, her apron was dusted to the waist, and her boots had a good heavy coating of dark soil, and she made no apology for either. He had already stepped down from the buggy. He was a spare, careful-looking man, somewhere past 50, with the kind of face that had learned to show nothing useful. He opened his leather case without greeting her and produced a ledger already marked to her page. "Clara Bowen," he said, "claim Section 11, Republican River Valley." He read it the way a man reads a number off a fence post. Then he looked up and said he was required to conduct a mid-season assessment. She said she understood. He walked the field perimeter. She walked 2 steps behind him and said nothing. He stopped where a row had thinned, 3 plants lost in a cluster from early damage before the pen was fully operational, and he made a note in the ledger. She watched his pencil move and felt the note land somewhere in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. He stopped at the rolling pen folded against the fence post. He looked at it for a long moment. The baling wire, the wagon rims, the scrap lumber, the hens moving behind the wire in the warm shade, scratching contentedly at the soil. He frowned, not the laughing frown of Jed Proctor, but a bureaucratic frown, the frown of a man trying to fit an unusual thing into the correct column of a form. He wrote something in the ledger. She could not see what. When he turned back to her, his voice was measured and flat, and not unkind. Exactly, but not kind either. He said the claim required demonstrated productive yield by final assessment, which he scheduled for the last week of September. He said that current stand density was marginal. He said if she could not show measurable harvest by that date, the patent would be denied and the claim would revert. He closed the ledger. He said he hoped the season turned in her favor. He climbed back into the buggy and drove south down the road without looking back. And the dust his wheels raised hung in the still air long after the sound of him was gone. 93 days. She counted them standing right there in the field. Then she went to move the pen. The morning after Mr. Whitcomb's visit arrived without ceremony, just the same pale light pushing through the same cracks in the sod walls, the same cold ash in the stove, the same weight in her chest that had been there since she opened her eyes. 92 days now. She rolled the number over in her mind while she built the fire, while she scooped cornmeal into the iron pot, while she pulled on her boots and walked out into the yard where the hens were already stirring in their pen. 92 days. She did not let herself calculate what she would need per day to reach the kind of harvest that would satisfy a man like Whitcomb. She had done that calculation in the dark hours of the night, and the answer had been a number she did not care to revisit. Better to work. Work did not lie. She pushed the pen to the 7th row before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. The ground here was different from the soil near the creek, lighter, thinner, the kind of dirt that had never quite decided to be farmland. She could feel it in the drag of the wheel rims, in the way the hens had to scratch harder to find anything worth eating. But they found them. Every few feet, a sharp peck, a quick swallow, another worm gone. She marked the progress on the board nailed to the cellar door that evening. Row 7, first pass complete. 33 rows left. 33 rows that had not seen a single hen. She stood in the cellar with the candle flickering and looked at the grid she had drawn. The untreated section ran like a dark stain along the eastern edge of the field. She would need to start doubling back, covering rows twice if she wanted the soil to be turned enough to hold moisture through the dry weeks ahead. She did not know yet that the dry weeks would become a drought. She only knew that the air had stopped tasting like rain. The next afternoon she saw the first wagon. It came from the east, slow and deliberate, pulled by a sway-backed mare that knew the road by memory. The man on the seat was old Cletus Morrow, who lived 5 miles down the valley and had not spoken to her since she turned down his offer to buy her father's plow at auction the year before. He slowed as he passed her fence line, not stopped, just slowed, the way a man slows when he wants to see something without admitting he is looking. She was at the far end of the field, bent over the pen, resetting a wire that had loosened on the frame. She did not straighten. She let him look. After a long moment, he clucked to the mare and moved on. But he did not look away from her field until the road bent and took him from sight. That evening, Mrs. Danforth's girl rode past on her way back from Hastings and stopped long enough to say that her mother had sent her to see if Clara had any eggs to spare. It was the first time anyone from the Danforth place had spoken to her since the blizzard of '81. Clara filled a basket and handed it over the fence, and the girl took it without meeting her eyes. The way you take something from a person you have been told not to trust. The mockery did not stop. She heard it in the distance, not aimed at her directly, but carried on the wind from the road, from the porch of Hastings Supply, from the open door of the blacksmith shop. Chicken wagon had become a kind of shorthand, a way of saying everything that needed to be said about a woman who did not know when to quit. She heard Jed Proctor's voice in her memory, that full-bellied laugh bending him over the fence post, and she pressed her mouth together and kept pushing. The pen moved forward. The hens scratched. The soil darkened behind them. July came in with a heat that felt personal, the kind of heat that does not simply sit on the land but presses into it, pushing down until the ground gives up its moisture and the creeks begin to shrink and the corn leaves curl at the edges in the middle of the afternoon. Clara carried water from the well every evening, 2 buckets at a time, 1 in each hand, walking the long rows to pour a thin rose at the base of the weakest stalks. She knew it was not enough. She could see it in the way the corn had stopped its steady climb, in the way the tassels seemed to hesitate before breaking open. The roots were searching deeper and finding less. She pushed the pen harder. By the 2nd week of July, she had covered every row at least once. The eastern edge, the thinnest soil, had seen 2 passes. She could see the difference where the hens had worked, not just in the absence of worms, but in the soil itself. It was looser, darker, holding the morning dew longer than the crusted ground just 10 feet away. She crouched beside the line one afternoon, pressed her fingers into the treated soil, and then into the untreated. The difference was there, plain as a fence post. The droppings and the scratching had done something she had not planned, something she had only begun to suspect. The chickens were feeding the field. She stood up and looked at the long green rows, and for the first time since May, she allowed herself to think that maybe the arithmetic could work. She needed more birds. That was the arithmetic she did next. The pen covered a row at a time, but the field was 40 rows long, and each row needed multiple passes to keep the worms from returning. At 10 hens per pen, she could cover perhaps 3 rows per week if she worked from dawn to dusk. That left the other rows vulnerable for weeks at a stretch. The cutworms would not wait. She calculated what she had to trade. The root cellar held a surplus of dried beans, too many for one woman to eat before winter. The garden had produced early squash that she had preserved in salt brine. She had a bolt of flannel she had been saving for a winter dress, and a side of bacon she had cured in the spring. She made a list on a scrap of paper, then crossed out half of it because she knew what she could part with and what she could not. The bacon stayed, the flannel stayed, the beans went. She rode to the Halverson place on a Sunday afternoon, when she knew they would be home and the work would be paused for the Lord's Day. Emery Halverson met her at the fence, his youngest girl clinging to his trouser leg. He was a quiet man, slow to speak, slower to trust. She explained what she needed: pullets, young hens, any bird that could lay or scratch. She offered dried beans and a standing agreement to help with the harvest if her field came in. He looked at her for a long time, the way a man looks at a proposition he is not sure he believes. Then he said he had 6 young hens that were eating more than they were earning, and he would trade them for the beans and a promise of 3 days' labor at harvest time. She agreed without haggling. She tied the crate of birds to the back of the saddle and rode home with the hens complaining the whole way. The next week, she heard about the widow Bodine, who lived south along the creek and had more chickens than she could feed through the winter. Clara walked the 4 miles on a Tuesday morning, carrying a basket of preserves and a length of good muslin. The widow was a thin woman with eyes that had seen too much and a voice that had learned not to waste words. They struck a deal: 12 birds for the preserves, the muslin, and a promise to help mend the widow's roof before the autumn rains. Clara walked home with a crate on her back and a new understanding of how quickly a woman's world could expand when she stopped caring what people thought of her. By the end of July, she had close to 80 birds. She built a second pen from the remaining lumber, longer than the first and lower to the ground, with baling wire pulled so tight that her fingers bled through the cloth she wrapped them in. She rigged a rope and stake system to drag the second pen forward while she worked the first, moving in a slow pattern across the field, east to west, then back again, the hens in each pen scratching their way through the cracked August soil. The corn noticed. She saw it in the deeper green of the leaves, in the way the stalks thickened at the base, in the silk that pushed out clean and golden and full of promise. The treated rows were a hand's breadth taller than the untreated sections that still waited for their first pass. She stood at the north end of the field one evening and traced the pattern with her eyes: dark green where the pens had worked, lighter green where they had not yet reached. The difference was a map of everything she had done since May. She did not let herself feel proud. There was no time for pride. But she let herself feel something close to hope, and she carried that feeling back to the cabin like a candle cupped against the wind. The drought deepened. By the first week of August, the Republican River had dropped so low that the crossing at the south bend was no deeper than a man's boot top. The creeks that fed it were dry beds of cracked mud, and the wells along the valley were going brackish one by one. Clara hauled water from her own well twice a day, morning and evening, each trip taking longer as the water table dropped and the bucket had to be lowered deeper. She poured it at the base of the corn in careful measures, spread thin across the rows that needed it most. She knew it was not enough. She knew the rain would have to come soon, or nothing she had done would matter. But she kept hauling, kept pushing, kept the pens moving through the long, hot afternoons while the hens scratched and pecked and the worms disappeared into their crops. She heard the news field by field. The Darnell place lost its entire west quarter in 3 nights. The Prentice boys were seen pulling their corn by the roots, which meant there was nothing left worth leaving standing. The valley took on a hollow, waiting quality, the kind that comes when people know more bad news is coming and have already started grieving what is not yet gone. Clara kept her head down and pushed the pen. She did not attend the Sunday services where the farmers gathered to compare losses. She did not ride into Hastings to hear the talk. She stayed on her land, moving from row to row, counting the days until September. 20 rows left to treat, then 18, then 15. On a Thursday afternoon, the sky turned a color she had not seen since spring, a low, bruised gray that pressed down on the valley like a lid. The air went still. The birds stopped singing. She stood in the field with her hands on the push bar and watched the clouds gather above the western ridge. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of dust and dry grass, and beneath it, something else, something clean and cold that she had almost forgotten. Rain. She stood there as the first drops fell, fat and heavy, striking the cracked soil and vanishing almost instantly. The rain came harder. She lifted her face to it and let it soak her dress, her hair, the dust on her apron. She did not move. The hens huddled in the pen, fluffing their feathers and complaining, but she did not move. She stood in the rain until her boots were wet through, and then she went to the cellar and took down the board from behind the door and drew a line through the date. Rain. Finally, rain. It rained for 2 days, not a hard driving storm, but a steady, soaking rain that sank into the ground and stayed there. The creek rose. The wells began to recover. And the corn, which had been holding its breath through the long, dry weeks, began to grow again. She could see it in the morning, the leaves a deeper green than the day before, the stalks pushing upward with a renewed purpose that made her chest ache with something she could not name. She pushed the pens through the wet rows, the soil soft and willing beneath the wheel rims, the hens scratching with renewed energy in the cool, damp air. 7 rows left, then 5, then 3. The morning she finished the last row, there were 3 weeks left until Whitcomb's September assessment. She folded the pen against the fence post and stood at the edge of the field, looking at what she had done. 40 rows of corn, green and tall and filling, the tassels fully open and the silk beginning to brown at the tips. The soil beneath them was dark and loose and alive. She walked the length of the field once, slowly, letting her hand trail across the tops of the leaves. Then she went to the cellar and took down the board and drew a single line through the last untreated row. The sound of hoofbeats came from the road, moving slow, the pace of a horse whose rider was not in a hurry but had come with a purpose. She climbed the cellar steps and walked to the fence. It was Jed Proctor. He was not laughing this time. His hat was in his hands, held against his chest the way a man holds something he is about to lay down. He did not look at her. He looked at the corn. His jaw worked the way a man's jaw works when he has made himself come somewhere he did not want to come. She waited. He cleared his throat, swallowed, and then said the words that had been building in the valley all summer. "My south acreage is gone." He said it the same way a person says the word gone when they mean something that cannot be taken back. "The worms came through in 3 nights. There's nothing standing in 12 rows. He stopped. The silence stretched. Then he looked at her, and she saw something in his face she had never seen there before. It was not shame, exactly. It was the look of a man who had discovered that the thing he laughed at was the thing that could have saved him. He did not ask for help. He stood there with his hat in his hands and waited for her to decide what to do. Clara Bowen stood at the fence and looked at Jed Proctor, the man who had laughed at her from the saddle 3 months ago, who had spread the name Chicken Wagon across the valley like a seed he expected to grow, who had made her the subject of every joke told at Hastings Supply through the long, dry weeks of July. That man stood before her now with his hat in his hands and his fields dead behind him. She did not feel triumph. She felt something closer to weariness, the tired recognition that the same pride that had made him laugh at her now brought him here with nothing to offer but the truth. She did not make him wait. She said she could spare 1 pen and 6 hens, that the pen would need rope stakes at each end to hold it in the row, that the birds needed water morning and evening, and that he should start at the south end and push north and not change direction once he started, because the hens would learn the routine and work better for it. He nodded. His hat was still in his hands. She went and got the spare pen, the third one she had built from the last of the Anderson barn boards, and 6 of the calmest hens, the ones that had been at this longest. She passed them through the gate without ceremony. He took them without ceremony. He said thank you in a voice that was doing several things at once, and then he turned his horse and rode west toward his own dead fields, the pen balanced across the saddle in front of him and the hens in a crate tied behind. She watched him until the road bent and took him from sight, and then she went back to her rows. The news traveled faster than she expected. Within 2 days, every farm in the valley knew that Jed Proctor had taken the chicken wagon. The talk shifted, not in her favor, but into something more complicated. Some said she had tricked him into it. Some said he had lost his mind along with his corn. A few, very few, said nothing at all and simply waited to see what would happen. Clara kept her head down and pushed her pens through the rows that still needed a second pass, but she felt the change in the air. The mockery had not stopped, but it had quieted. The silence was worse in some ways. Silence meant they were watching, waiting for her to fail, so they could say they had known all along. The second week of August brought a cold wind from the north. It came in the night, a sharp drop in temperature that left the morning grass stiff with frost in the low spots. Clara woke shivering in the dark and knew before she lit the lamp that something had changed. She pulled on her coat over her nightdress and walked barefoot to the field. The corn stood in the gray light, the leaves stiff and dark, the tips of the tassels bent under a thin crust of ice. She walked the rows slowly, touching each stalk, checking the ears. The frost had hit the lowest ground hardest, the hollows near the creek where the cold air had settled. The corn there was damaged, the outer husks blackened, the kernels soft beneath her thumbnail. She counted the affected stalks. Not many, maybe a dozen, but enough to tell her what she already knew. The season was turning, and it would not wait for her to be ready. She spent the rest of the week pulling in what was mature enough to harvest, stacking the ears in the wagon, carrying them to the root cellar by lamplight. She worked until her hands were raw and her back refused to straighten. She did not stop to eat. She did not stop to rest. She pulled the corn that was ready and left the rest standing, hoping the weather would hold long enough for the late ears to fill. The hens worked the rows she had already harvested, scratching through the stubble, turning the soil one last time. She watched them from the cellar door one evening and realized she had not once thanked them. She had no words for chickens, but she stood there a moment and let herself feel grateful for their steady, uncomplaining work. The next week, the cold returned. Not a frost this time, but a hard chill that settled into the valley and did not lift. The sky stayed gray. The wind came from the north every afternoon, carrying the smell of snow from somewhere far away. Clara checked the corn each morning, pressing her thumbnail into the kernels, reading the milk. The ears were filling, but slowly, too slowly. She needed 2 more weeks of good weather, maybe 3, to bring the field to full harvest. The sky offered no promises. Then the Okafor family stopped by on their way to Hastings. The father, Samuel Okafor, was a quiet man with a careful way of speaking that Clara had always respected. He pulled his wagon up to her fence and climbed down slowly, the way a man does when he has something heavy to say. He told her that the frost had taken half his crop the night before. Not the low spots, but the whole field. He said he had heard about her pens, about the worms, about the soil. He asked if she had any advice. She looked at his face, at the lines that had deepened around his eyes since spring, and she told him the truth. It might be too late for this season, but if he wanted to try, she could spare a pen and a few birds for a week. He nodded. He did not laugh. He did not thank her effusively. He simply nodded, the way a man nods when he has received something he did not know how to ask for. She went to the cellar and brought out the second pen, the one she had used for the eastern rows, and 8 hens that had proven themselves steady workers. She helped him load them into his wagon, and he drove away without looking back. The valley was changing. She felt it in the way people looked at her now, not with derision, but with something closer to curiosity, the kind that precedes either respect or resentment, and she could not yet tell which would come. She kept working. The corn that remained in the field was the best of it. The ears that had filled on the soil the hens had worked most thoroughly. They were thick and heavy, the kernels deep gold and tight against the cob. She pulled them one by one, stacking them in the wagon, filling the root cellar until there was no room left for anything else. She counted the bushels by rough estimate and compared them to the number she had written on the board in the cellar. She was close. Close enough that one more good week would put her over. That week did not come. On a Tuesday morning, she stepped out of the cabin and found the world white. Not snow, but frost, heavy, killing frost that had settled on every surface and turned the remaining corn to glass. She walked to the field without hurrying, because there was no point in hurrying now. The stalk stood frozen, the ears suspended in the moment before thaw, the kernels solid and useless beneath the husks. She touched one ear, and the husk crackled under her fingers. She did not pull it. She stood in the field with her hands at her sides and counted what she had lost. Roughly a quarter of the crop, the part that had needed another week, the part that would have made the difference between a good harvest and a bare one. She turned and walked back to the cabin without looking at the field again. The next day, she rode to Hastings to pick up salt for preserving what she had already harvested. The store was fuller than usual. A half-dozen men gathered around the stove, their voices low and their postures heavy with the kind of defeat that comes from watching a season slip away. They went quiet when she walked in. She felt their eyes on her back as she crossed to the counter, felt the weight of their attention like a hand pressing between her shoulder blades. Hastings took her order without meeting her eyes and wrapped the salt in brown paper. She paid and turned to leave. One of the men by the stove, she did not know his name but recognized him as a farmer from the North Bend, cleared his throat and said, "I hear Proctor's field is coming back." She stopped. She turned. The man looked at her, not with hostility, but with the flat look of someone stating a fact he does not quite believe. "The rows he put your chickens on. They're green, not a worm in sight." She stood there a moment, the salt under her arm, the silence of the store pressing in around her. Then she nodded, the way she had learned to nod when she did not know what to say, and walked out into the cold October sunlight. She did not feel vindicated. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the weight of everything that still hung in the balance, the assessment that was now only 10 days away, the corn that had frozen in the field, the arithmetic that she had not yet been able to finish. She rode home with the salt in the saddlebag and the image of Whitcomb's ledger in her mind, the same ledger that had been open in the store when she walked through, the same column where her name was written. She did not know if it was enough. She did not know if any of it had been enough. But she knew one thing, she was not done yet. She had a root cellar full of corn, a pen full of hens that had done more than any neighbor had believed possible, and 10 days left to prove that a woman with a chicken wagon could do what none of them had thought to try. She pushed the cabin door open and set the salt on the table. The candle was low, but she did not light another. She sat in the dark and waited for morning. She woke before the candle had burned out. The wax pooled at the base of the holder, the flame guttering in the draft from the door. The root cellar was cold, the air heavy with the smell of dried corn and earth. She descended the steps and stood among the stacks of ears, running her hand across the husks, feeling the weight of what she had saved. The frost had taken the last of the field, but the cellar was full. She counted the bushels again, slowly, the way you count something when you are afraid the number has changed overnight. But it had not. The number was the same as the night before, and it was still not enough. She was short, not by much, perhaps 3 bushels, perhaps 4, but short enough that she could feel the gap like a missing tooth, a place where something solid should have been and was not. She stood in the dim light with her hand on a basket of ears and tried to think of what else she could do. There was nothing left to trade. The preserves were gone, the muslin was gone, the flannel was gone. She had given away her spare pens and her best hens, and she did not regret any of it. But she could not call them back now. The assessment was 9 days away, and the arithmetic did not bend for hope. The morning air was sharp, the frost still white on the grass when she stepped outside. She walked to the field where the frozen corn stood, the stalks brittle and silent, and she began to pull what was left. Not for harvest, the ears were ruined, the kernels soft and useless, but for clearing. She had to prepare the ground for spring, whether she would be here to plant it or not. The work kept her hands busy and her mind quiet, and she needed that quiet. She pulled the frozen stalks one by one, stacking them at the edge of the field, the rhythm of the work settling into her arms and her back, the way prayer settles into a person who has no church to go to. She worked until her fingers were numb and the sun had climbed above the ridge, and then she stopped, because she heard something she had not expected to hear. Samuel Okafor's voice calling her name from the road. He was standing at her gate, his wagon loaded with crates. Not empty crates, but full ones, packed with ears of corn still in their husks. She walked to the fence and looked at him. He told her that he had heard about her frost loss, that he had also heard about the assessment, that he had 10 bushels of corn stored in his own cellar that he had harvested early, before the frost had taken his field. He said he would trade them for the loan of her pens and her hens for the following spring. He said it simply, the way a man says something he has already decided and does not intend to argue about. She looked at his face, at the quiet certainty in his eyes, and she understood that he was not offering charity. He was offering a fair exchange, the kind of trade that made both of them stronger. She extended her hand. They shook on it. She spent the afternoon hauling the crates down to her cellar, stacking them alongside her own harvest, the combined total now edging past what she had written on the board. She stood in the dim light and counted one more time, slowly, and this time the number held. She closed the cellar door and leaned her forehead against the wood and let herself breathe. The wind shifted that evening. She felt it as she closed the cellar door, a warm gust from the south that smelled of dry grass and something else, something sharp and unfamiliar, the smell of a season turning too fast. She walked to the ridge above the creek and looked toward the horizon. There was a glow, low and orange, far to the south. Prairie fire. Her stomach tightened the way it always did when she saw that color at dusk. She had heard stories of fires that swept across the plains in dry autumns, consuming everything in their path, leaving nothing but black earth and ash. The glow was still miles away, but the wind was blowing straight up the valley, pushing the fire toward her. She stood on the ridge and watched it move, a line of flame advancing across the land, smoke rising in dark columns against the orange sky. She could see where it had already passed, black swaths where fields had been, where barns had stood, where the neighbors she had not spoken to in months had stored their remaining harvest. The fire did not discriminate. It took what was dry and left what was not. And the valley had been dry for a long, long time. She walked back to the cabin and began to move what she could. Not the corn. The root cellar was dug into the side of the ridge, the walls thick with sod, and the door set low against the earth. Fire could not reach it. The fire could not reach the pens either. The wire and the boards would burn, but the hens could be moved. She caught them one by one in the falling dark, tucking each bird under her arm and carrying them to the root cellar, where she shut them in with the corn. They complained loudly, but she did not have time to soothe them. She went back for the remaining pens, dragged them away from the fence and into the bare dirt of the yard, where there was nothing for the fire to catch. Then she stood at the edge of her property and waited. The fire came on through the night. She could hear it before she could see it clearly, a low roar like a distant waterfall, and the heat of it pressed against her face, even from a quarter-mile away. She watched it take the Danforth place, the barn going up in a single sheet of flame, the house following moments later. She watched it take the Prentice field, the dry stalks catching and burning in seconds, the fire leaping from row to row like something alive and hungry. She did not move. She could not fight it. She could only stand and wait and trust that the work she had done all summer would be enough. The fire reached her fence line just before midnight. The grass along the road was dry and tall, and the flames took it eagerly, racing along the edge of her property. She watched them approach the field where the frozen corn still stood. The stalks were dead, but they were still standing, and they would burn. But the fire stopped. It reached the place where the hens had worked, where the soil had been turned and scratched and fed all summer long, where the droppings and the debris had made a kind of dampness that the fire could not cross. The flames faltered. They licked at the edge of the treated ground and then pulled back, finding nothing to hold. The fire moved north along the fence line, skirting the field, leaving her corn standing in a perfect island of dark green against the blackened land around it. She stood on the ridge and watched the fire go, the glow fading into the northern distance, the roar diminishing to a crackle and then to silence. She did not sleep that night. She walked the perimeter of her field in the dark, checking for stray embers, stamping out the small fires that had caught in the grass along the fence. The sky cleared as the fire moved on, and the stars came out, cold and bright and indifferent. She walked until her legs ached and her eyes burned from the smoke, and then she sat on the edge of the root cellar door with the hens murmuring inside, and watched the dawn come up over a valley she barely recognized. The fire had taken everything it could reach. The Danforth house was a pile of black timbers. The Prentice field was ash. The Proctor place she could not see from here, but she knew the fire had passed through that direction. She thought of Jed Proctor's borrowed pen, the 6 hens she had given him, the rows he had been working. She did not know if he had moved them in time. She did not know if the pen had survived. She sat with that uncertainty the way you sit with a stone in your hand, feeling its weight without being able to set it down. The sun rose and the valley came to life in the way that valleys do after a fire. Birds returned to the blackened ground, searching for insects. Smoke still rose in thin columns from the places where the fire had burned deepest. Clara walked to the road and looked south. The road itself was black, the grass on either side gone, the fence posts charred but still standing. She saw a figure in the distance, walking toward her. It was a man, and he was carrying something. She waited. The man came closer, and she recognized him. It was Jed Proctor. He was carrying her pen. His hands were black with soot, his shirt torn at the shoulder, his face streaked with smoke and sweat. He reached her gate and set the pen down carefully, the way you set down something that has cost you more than you expected to pay. He told her that he had moved the hens into his root cellar before the fire reached his place, that the pen had been too close to the fence, and he had gone back for it when he saw the flames coming, that he had lost his barn and his tool shed and most of his remaining fencing, that his house had survived, barely, because the wind had shifted at the last minute. He told her these things in a flat, tired voice, the voice of a man who has stopped trying to make sense of what has happened and is simply reporting the facts. Then he looked at her field. He looked at the dark green stalk standing against the blackened ground, and he was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different. He said, "Your corn is still standing." She did not answer. There was nothing to say. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he does not understand, something he has been wrong about for a long time. He said, "The fire stopped at your line. I saw it from the ridge." It just stopped. She told him about the hens, about the soil, about the way the scratching and the droppings had changed the ground. She told him simply, the way you tell someone something you have learned the hard way. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he picked up the pen and slung it over his shoulder. He said he would bring her hens back in the morning. He said he had 3 rows left that had not burned, and he wanted to finish them. He walked back the way he had come, and she watched him go, the pen bouncing against his back, his boots leaving prints in the ash. The next day, the valley began to stir. Wagons moved along the road, carrying what little had been saved. People came to her fence, not to mock, but to ask. They asked about the fire, about the corn, about the chickens. They asked in voices that were careful and quiet, the voices of people who had lost everything and were looking for something to hold on to. Clara answered as best she could. She showed them the soil where the hens had worked, the difference in the ground, the way the moisture held. She gave them advice, not as someone who knew everything, but as someone who had tried something and seen it work. They listened. Some of them wrote things down. Some of them just nodded and walked away, carrying the idea with them like a seed. The day before the assessment, the sky cleared and the wind died. The valley lay quiet under a cold October sun, the blackened fields stretching in every direction, punctuated here and there by the green of a surviving patch of corn. Clara walked her field in the afternoon, checking each ear one last time. Her hands moved over the husks, testing the weight, feeling the tightness of the kernels beneath. She climbed the ridge and looked south down the valley. The road was empty. The air was still. She went to the root cellar and opened the door, and the hens came streaming out, shaking themselves, scratching in the ash of the yard. She stood in the door and looked at the stacks of corn, at the board with her marks, at the sum of everything she had done since May. It was enough. She did not know if it would be enough for Whitcomb, but it was enough for her. She closed the door and leaned against it, and for the first time in months, she let herself rest. The last light faded, the stars came out. Somewhere in the dark, a hen made a small, contented sound. Clara Bowen listened to the night and waited for morning. The morning of the assessment came cold and still, the kind of stillness that settles over a valley after a fire, when even the birds are uncertain where to land. Clara rose before light, pulled on her heaviest dress, and walked the field one last time while the frost still held the grass. The corn stood in rows that had become as familiar to her as the lines on her own palm, each stalk a marker of where she had been, what she had done, how many times she had pushed the pen past this spot or that. She did not pray. She did not make promises to herself. She simply walked, letting her hand trail across the tops of the leaves, feeling the cold moisture settle on her fingers. The root cellar was ready. She had counted the bushels 3 times the night before, and the number had not changed. The crates from Samuel Okafor were stacked at the back, the ears clean and dry and heavy. She had closed the door and leaned against it, and told herself that it was enough. It had to be enough. The sun rose over the ridge, thin and pale, the light falling across the blackened fields that surrounded her green patch of ground like a dark frame around a painting. She stood at the fence and watched the road, her hands resting on the top rail, her breath misting in the cold air. She had been waiting for this day since June. Now that it was here, she felt nothing, not fear, not hope, not the desperate knot in her stomach that had carried her through the summer. Just a quiet emptiness, the kind that comes when you have done everything you can and the only thing left is to let the world decide. She saw the buggy before she heard it, a dark shape moving along the road from the south. It came slowly, picking its way around the charred sections where the fire had burned close to the road, the horse stepping carefully over the blackened ground. Mr. Whitcomb sat upright on the seat, his coat buttoned to the collar, his leather case beside him. He did not hurry. He had never hurried, not once in all the months she had dealt with him. She stayed at the fence and watched him approach, and when he pulled up at her gate, she did not move to open it. He climbed down, stamping his boots on the hard ground, and looked at her without greeting. Then he looked at the field. He stood there for a long time, his hands resting on his hips, his eyes moving slowly across the rows. She watched his face, waiting for the frown, the note in the ledger, the words that would tell her whether the last 5 months had been enough. But he did not speak. He walked to the fence and put his hand on the top rail, the same rail she had been holding a moment before, and he said, "You survived the fire." It was not a question. She said, "Yes, sir." He looked at the field again. "Your neighbors lost everything. Danforth, Prentice, Proctor." He paused. "Proctor lost his barn, but he saved his house and his chickens. He said you gave him a pen." She said nothing. Whitcomb turned to look at her directly. His face was the same careful mask it had always been, but something had shifted behind his eyes, a kind of recalibration, the slow adjustment of a man who has discovered he has been using the wrong measurements. He said, "I'd like to see the field first, and then the cellar." She nodded and walked ahead of him, through the gate and down the first row. The ground was firm beneath her boots, the frost melting in the thin sunlight. She did not look back to see if he was following. She knew he was. She could hear the measured tread of his boots on the hard soil, the occasional pause when he stopped to examine a stalk, the rustle of his coat as he bent to look at something. She kept walking until she reached the end of the row, then turned and walked back along the next one. He was crouched near the middle of the field, his fingers pressed into the soil. He looked up as she approached and said, "This ground is different." She stopped. "Yes, sir." "How?" It was the first time he had asked her a question that sounded like he actually wanted the answer. She told him. She told him about the hens, about the pen, about the scratching and the droppings, and the way the soil changed after the birds had worked through. She told him about the worms and the drought and the frost. And she told him about the fire and the way it had stopped at the edge of the treated rows. She spoke plainly, the way she had learned to speak about things that mattered, without embellishment or apology. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood up and brushed the dirt from his hands. He looked at the field again, and this time there was something different in his face. It was not approval. He was not a man who gave approval easily. But it was something close to attention, the focused attention of a man who is seeing something he has never seen before. He walked the rest of the field in silence. She followed at a distance, watching him stop at the edges where the fire had burned closest, watching him examine the line where the blackened grass met the green corn. He took a small notebook from his coat pocket and made several entries, the pencil moving quickly in his careful hand. Then he walked to the root cellar. She opened the door and stepped aside. The smell of dried corn and earth rose from the darkness, warm and rich. He descended the steps slowly, his boots echoing on the wooden stairs, and she heard him stop at the bottom. She did not follow. She stood at the top of the steps and waited, her hands folded in front of her heart beating the slow, steady rhythm it had learned over the long months of waiting. The silence stretched. She heard him moving among the crates, heard the rustle of husks as he examined the ears. The minutes passed. The sun climbed higher, and the frost melted from the grass, and still she waited. When he came up, his face was unreadable. He closed the cellar door behind him and stood on the step, the notebook in his hand, his coat dusted with the fine powder of dried husks. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened the notebook and read from it in the same flat voice he had used the first time he came to her field. Clara Bowen, Claim Section 11, Republican River Valley. Mid-season assessment recorded June 28th. Final assessment conducted this day, October 2nd. He paused. Stand density within acceptable limits. Pest damage minimal. Total estimated yield, 63 bushels of shelled corn, with an additional quantity retained for seed. He looked up from the notebook. The claim meets the requirements for productive use as defined by the Homestead Act of 1862. She heard the words. She heard them the way you hear a sound from a great distance, a sound you have been listening for so long that when it finally comes, you are not sure you have heard it at all. She said nothing. She could not speak. Whitcomb closed the notebook and put it in his pocket. He looked at her, and for the first time in all the months she had known him, his face softened, just slightly, just enough that she could see the man beneath the bureaucrat. He said, "I will recommend the patent be granted. You will receive the final document from the land office in Lincoln by the end of the month." He paused. "I have been doing this work for 23 years. I have never seen a claim saved by a chicken pen." He said it without humor, without irony. He said it the way you say something you are still trying to understand. And then he climbed into his buggy and drove away, the wheels crunching over the ash, the horse's hooves leaving small prints in the blackened road. She stood at the fence and watched him go. The buggy grew smaller, the road bent, and then he was gone. She did not move. The sun was warm on her shoulders, and the corn stood green and tall behind her, and the root cellar was full. She stood there until the wind picked up and the cold returned, and then she walked to the cabin and closed the door and sat down at the table where the candle had burned down to nothing. She put her hands flat on the wood and looked at them. They were the same hands that had pushed the pen through the rows, that had carried the buckets, that had caught the hens and traded the preserves and counted the bushels. They were dirty, the nails broken, the skin cracked from the cold. She looked at them for a long time, and then she pressed them to her face and cried. The tears came without warning, without sound, the kind of tears that have been waiting a long time to be let out. She sat at the table and let them come, and when they stopped, the candle was gone, and the room was dark, and she could not feel the cold anymore. She rose and went to the cellar and opened the door. The hens murmured in the darkness, settling for the night. She stood among the stacks of corn, the smell of the harvest filling the small space, and she let herself feel it, what she had done, what it meant, what it had cost. The patent would come, the land would be hers. She had done what no one in the valley had thought possible, done it with a rolling pen and a flock of hens, and a stubbornness that had refused to break. She closed the cellar door and went inside and lay down on her bed, still in her dress, still in her boots. She slept without dreaming for the first time in months. In the morning, she woke to the sound of hooves on the road. She rose and went to the door, expecting Whitcomb's buggy or a neighbor come to ask for advice. But it was not Whitcomb. It was not a neighbor. It was a wagon, loaded with crates, driven by a man she did not recognize. He pulled up at her gate and climbed down, holding a letter in his hand. He handed it to her without a word, and she opened it and read it while the man waited. The letter was from the land office in Lincoln, dated 3 days after Whitcomb's visit. It stated that the patent for Claim Section 11, Republican River Valley, had been approved and recorded, and that the final document would be delivered by the end of the month. It was signed by the commissioner himself. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket, the way she had folded the paper from Whitcomb back in September, the paper that had told her she had 80 days left. She looked at the man who was still waiting. He said there was a second delivery. He walked to the back of the wagon and lifted a crate from the stack, setting it at her feet. Inside, packed in straw, were 12 young hens, healthy and bright-eyed, and on top of the crate was a note. She opened it and read the single line. "For spring planting, from Proctor." She stood in the yard with the crate at her feet and the letter in her pocket, and the corn standing green behind her. The man climbed back onto the wagon and drove away. She did not watch him go. She knelt and opened the crate, and the young hens stepped out into the sunlight, blinking, scratching at the ground, already looking for something to work on. She watched them for a long time, and then she walked to the field, to the edge of the corn, to the place where the soil was darkest and the stalks stood tallest. She put her hand on the nearest stalk and felt the roughness of the husk, the solid weight of the ear, the quiet certainty of something that had grown from nothing into everything it was meant to be. The valley was quiet. The fire was ash. The winter was coming. But Clara Bowen's land was hers. The crate sat at her feet, the young hens settling into the straw, their heads turning to take in the unfamiliar yard. Clara Bowen looked from the note in her hand to the birds and back again. "For spring planting, from Proctor." She read the words a second time, then a third, letting them settle into the place where resentment might have lived if she had been the kind of woman who held grudges. She was not. She had never had the energy for it. The land required everything she had, and there was nothing left over for keeping score. She lifted the crate and carried it to the pen she had rebuilt after the fire, the one she had kept for herself, the one she would need when the snow melted and the ground softened and the whole cycle began again. She set the young hens inside, and they stepped out into the enclosure with the same tentative curiosity that all new creatures bring to unfamiliar ground. She watched them for a moment, then closed the gate and went back to the house. The letter from Lincoln remained in her pocket. She took it out and read it again at the kitchen table, the paper smooth and official, the ink dark and precise. It said the patent had been recorded. It said the land was hers. It said everything she had worked for was now a fact, written down and sealed and beyond dispute. She folded it carefully and placed it in the tin box under the floorboard. The same box that had held her savings, the same box that had been empty when she needed it most. Now it held the document that made her a landowner, and she closed the lid and slid the box back into its place and stood up with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has finished something important. The weeks after the assessment passed slowly. The valley settled into the rhythm of autumn, the days growing shorter, the cold creeping in from the north each evening. The neighbors who had lost everything in the fire began the slow work of rebuilding. Clara saw them on the road, their wagons loaded with lumber and nails and whatever they had managed to save. They nodded to her now when they passed, not with the old silence, but with something that resembled respect. She did not know what to do with that, so she did what she always did. She kept working. She hauled water for the hens, repaired the pens where the winter winds had loosened the wire, hauled the last of the corn from the root cellar to shell and store for the winter. The work filled the days, and the days filled the weeks, and before she knew it, the first snow had fallen, and the valley was white and quiet. Jed Proctor came on a Sunday afternoon in late November. The snow had melted from the road, leaving mud and frozen ruts, and his horse picked its way carefully along the edge of the ditch. He was alone. He did not have the pen with him, or the hens she had lent him. He came empty-handed, his coat collar turned up against the wind, his hat pulled low. He tied his horse at the gate and walked to the door, and when she opened it, he stood there without speaking for a long moment. The cold air curled around her ankles and she waited. He said her name. Clara Bowen. He said it the way you say a name you have learned to say differently than you used to. He cleared his throat. He said he had come to thank her properly. He said that the pen and the hens had saved the 3 rows that survived the fire, and that next spring he intended to build his own pen, with his own birds, and that he would tell anyone who asked where he had learned how to do it. He paused. The wind picked up, and the bare branches of the cottonwood rattled against each other. He said, "I laughed at you. I was wrong. I am sorry for that." Clara stood in the door and looked at him, at the man who had bent over her fence post and laughed until his horse shifted sideways, the same man who had spread the name Chicken Wagon across the valley like a seed he expected to grow. He was not laughing now. His eyes were steady, and his voice was low, and he was holding his hat in both hands, turning it slowly, the way a man turns a thing he is not sure what to do with. She said, "Thank you." That was all. She did not need to say more. He nodded, the way a man nods when he has been heard, and then he turned and walked back to his horse and rode away. She watched him until he disappeared around the bend, and then she closed the door and stood in the warmth of the cabin and felt something shift inside her chest, a settling that felt like forgiveness. The winter was hard, the snow came deep, and the cold stayed, and the creek froze solid from bank to bank. Clara kept the hens in the root cellar, where the earth held a steady temperature, and she fed them from the corn she had harvested. She split wood every morning and carried water from the well twice a day, the bucket freezing over between the well and the cabin. She patched the roof where the sod had crumbled, and she sealed the cracks in the walls with mud and straw. She read the almanac by lamplight and planned the spring planting. She did not feel lonely. She had the hens and the land and the memory of everything she had done to keep it. The patent arrived on a Tuesday in December. The mail carrier brought it in a heavy envelope, the paper thick and official, stamped with the seal of the United States government. She signed for it at the door and carried it to the table and opened it slowly, the way you open something you have been waiting for your whole life. The words were the same as the letter, but they carried more weight now, printed on the document that declared her the legal owner of Claim Section 11, Republican River Valley. She read it from beginning to end, and then she read it again. And then she placed it in the tin box under the floorboard and closed the lid and sat back on her heels. The cabin was quiet. The hens murmured in the cellar. The wind pushed against the walls. She sat there for a long time, letting the feeling of it settle into her bones. Spring came late that year, but it came. The snow melted, and the creek rose, and the ground softened the way it does when it has been waiting all winter for something to grow in it. Clara took the young hens from Proctor and added them to her flock. She repaired the rolling pens, tightening the wire, reinforcing the frames where the winter had weakened them. She walked the field every morning, watching the soil warm, waiting for the right moment to plant. The neighbors came to her now, not in silence but with questions. They asked about the pens, they asked about the soil, they asked about the hens, and about the worms, and about the fire. She answered as best she could, and she watched them go back to their own fields with seeds of understanding planted where mockery had once grown. On the first day of planting, she pushed the pen out into the field. The hens settled into their work as if they had never stopped, their heads tilting, their feet raking, their beaks finding the grubs and worms that had survived the winter. She pushed the frame down the first row, feeling the familiar resistance, the small give of the soil as the wheel rims rolled over it. The sun was warm on her shoulders. The creek was running full and clear. The sky above the valley was wide and blue and indifferent, the way it had always been, but it did not feel indifferent now. It felt like a witness. She pushed the pen to the end of the row and stopped, breathing hard, and looked back at the dark line of turned earth behind her. The hens were scratching contentedly, their crops full, their work done for the moment. She leaned on the push bar and let herself feel the simple satisfaction of a woman doing what she was meant to do. The Okafor family came by that afternoon, Samuel and his wife and their 2 children, carrying a crate of their own hens. They had built a pen over the winter, following her instructions, and they wanted her to see it. She walked to the fence and looked at it. The same design, the same baling wire, the same careful construction that she had figured out in the dark of a May night from scrap lumber and wagon rims. She told them it was a good pen. She told them to start at the south end and push north, and to let the hens set the pace. They thanked her and drove away, the pen balanced in the back of the wagon, the hens clucking in protest. She stood at the fence and watched them go, and she thought about how far the valley had come since the spring before. A week later, the first green shoots broke through the soil. She found them on a Tuesday morning, the same kind of Tuesday morning when she had found the cutworms the year before. But this time the stalks were straight and strong, and the soil was dark and loose around them. She knelt beside the first row and touched the pale tip of a shoot, feeling the life in it, the same life she had protected and fed and believed in when no one else did. She stood up and looked at the field, at the rows of green stretching toward the far fence, and she knew that this year would be different. The worms would come, they always came, but the hens would be ready. The soil would hold, and Clara Bowen would be here, on her own land, pushing her pen down the rows. On the last evening of April, she climbed the ridge above the creek and sat down on the grass. The sun was setting in a long band of gold and pink, the kind of sky that makes you believe the world is generous. The valley spread out below her, green and growing, the fields patched with the darker green of the earliest corn. She could see the Okafor place to the south, and beyond it the Proctor place, where a new barn was rising from the ashes of the old. The fire had taken much, but it had not taken everything. She sat there until the stars came out, and then she walked back down the ridge to the cabin. The hens were settled in their pen, making the small, contented sounds they always made at dusk. She closed the gate and stood in the yard, looking at the dark shape of the field against the fading sky. She thought about the woman who had stood in this same yard a year ago, desperate and alone, counting the days until the assessment. She thought about the laughter, the mockery, the long, dry weeks of August. She thought about the fire and the frost, and the moment she had opened the letter from Lincoln. And then she thought about the spring that had come anyway, steady and patient and full of promise. She turned and went inside, and the door closed behind her, and the night settled over the valley like a hand laid gently on something precious. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.